What is going on, Snooker fans, and welcome to this week's Snooker Digest episode, where we will be taking a look back at all of the key talking points from the first Triple Crown event of the new season, which saw Mark Selby take home his third UK title. And throughout the week, there was a constant subplot about the size of the pockets on the tables used at this year's tournament. Pockets, being referred to as buckets, have become commonplace over the past few years, and there has been a lot of suggestion that the tournaments in China are the biggest culprits for having larger pockets. Judd Trump has also been vocal recently about suggesting that the reason why tournament winners are becoming more spread out is because larger pockets are levelling the playing field. And after seeing what happened last week, perhaps you would suggest that he was right in that assessment. Neil Robertson also made comments in his post-match interviews about how these pockets are catching a lot of the younger players out because they can't just try and pot everything because they are not accurate enough to do that on these tables. And when you see the fact that the four semi-finalists this week were arguably four of the most accurate potters we have in the game at the moment, that argument does strengthen even more. Now, there might be a suggestion here that the top boys are sort of seeking advantageous conditions that they know that they can play in, but most of the tour can't. But I do think the general consensus amongst snooker fans is that we also prefer tighter pockets when watching matches. I know personally that watching balls drop into pockets after hitting the cushion several inches before the near jaw is questionable, and it does make snooker much more interesting to watch, in my opinion, when you've got sort of tighter pockets which are really challenging the players. Because yes, it is great watching matches where it's just century after century, but knowing there is a possibility that a player won't clear up is much more interesting for me. And we saw that last week, highlighted by the fact that we only saw 38 century breaks made at the venue, which is down from 45 made last year and a massive reduction from the 63 made in 2023. We also didn't see any breaks of 140 or above. Now, I don't think that necessarily reflects a drop in standard from the players, but more that pinpoint accuracy on these pockets caught a lot of players out. And that does include the players that done well in the event as well, and not just the youngsters. And then in addition to the tighter pockets, there also seemed to be a lot of talk about cues last week. We already know the issues Judd was having with his new cue, which resulted in him reverting back to his old cue last week. And just like he did in Saudi Arabia, he looked a lot more comfortable with it. Although he has not discounted the idea that he is still searching for that new perfect cue that gives him a little bit more power. But it wasn't just Judd. Kyren Wilson has also had to recently change his cue as well, due to his getting damaged a few months ago, and he seemed particularly interested in discussing different feral types when he was doing punditry work. And there was talk of Ronnie changing the brand of his cue at last season's World Championship as well. Now, obviously what happened to Kyren was a freak accident, but we are seeing more and more players making changes to their cues, and I do find that interesting. You know, from an armchair fan's point of view, it does seem a little surprising, and I do side with the comments made by Stephen Hendry a little, and he was talking about why players would voluntarily choose to do this, because a snooker cue isn't like a tennis racket or, darts for a darts player, where you can just change them all the time and be guaranteed to see the same results. And instead, a cue is very much personal to the individual player. But I suppose the idea is that at the very top of the game at the moment, the level is so high and it's so close between all the top players, and they are sort of wanting to find that extra 1% to get the edge over their opponents. But for the most part, changing cues or making changes to their cues does seem to be setting players back a couple of steps. But now, all of that aside, let's look at the action that actually did take place in the tournament. I've talked about the standard still being pretty high despite the pocket sizes. However, one complaint from a fan's point of view was there was a disappointing lack of drama in the tournament for the most part. Most matches were won fairly comfortably, and we only had 3 deciding frames over the entire tournament, with quite a few matches involving one player just completely outplaying their opponent. Ronnie O'Sullivan suffered a fairly predictable first round loss to Zhao Yulong, and as is always the case, question marks will now be raised about Ronnie's ability to compete at the very top level at the moment. But I do completely agree with what Alan McManus mentioned on TNT Sports, and that is that the Rocket is still playing pretty well, but because he is barely playing in any tournaments at the moment, he is just lacking in that match sharpness, which pretty much everyone else on tour has. He's only played in, I believe, 6 tournaments this season, whilst most players have played in at least 10 to 12. So as soon as he comes up against a player who is in decent nick, he is getting found out. So I do think if he wants to get back to challenging again, the only solution really is simply playing in more tournaments. But does he fancy doing that anymore? But in general across the tournament, there wasn't too many unexpected results really. Zhang Yanda and Pang Jianshu reaching the quarterfinals was about as close as we got to a run from an underdog in what was a tournament very much dominated by the big hitters. And I do prefer that. In most other tournaments, I always enjoy the underdog stories or seeing draws opening up because the top players are getting knocked out early. But when it comes to the Triple Crown events, the big tournaments, I really do prefer having all the big hitters playing against each other in the business end of the tournament. And with Selby, Trump, Murphy and Robertson all reaching the semi-finals, we certainly got just that last week. And if we do turn our attention to Judd Trump, losing in the final means he has gone the whole of 2025 without winning a title, as he won't be playing in either Scotland or the shootout this month. And it's the first time since 2013 that Judd has not won a tournament of any kind in a single calendar year. Now, in isolation, that would look like it might be a slight cause for concern, but in Judd's case, I really don't think it is. If we look at what he has done in 2025, well, he's reached 4 finals, and 3 of those have come within the past couple of months, and he also reached the semi-finals at the Masters and the World Championship as well. So it's not like his form has completely fallen off a cliff. He still had the kind of season that 99% of the tour would be killing to have. It's just the outrageously high standards he has set himself recently, which is why this is so surprising. Now, okay, losing 4 finals in a row is very un-Judd-like, but ultimately he is still knocking on the door of tournaments on a regular basis, so you expect things to turn around for him if he can keep putting himself into these positions in tournaments. And I was impressed by Judd last week, I really was. Not necessarily because he was playing brilliantly well, because he was still a couple of levels below his absolute best. But right from the opening ball against Stephen Maguire, he looked completely focused and looked like a man who was determined to defend that title. Now, Maguire did have a touch of bad fortune in the middle of that first round match when he was really building up a head of steam, and that did allow Judd to turn the match around. But Judd always looked up for the fight, and even though I said he was below his absolute best, the clearance he made against Si Jiahui was one of the best clearances you'll ever see. And even going into the final, Judd said he was so determined to win that title that he was going to have to be scraped off of the table. Now, obviously, he didn't quite manage to get the win, but he did always cling in there. Despite being 5-0 down, 6-2 down, he kept battling away, which is to his credit. And I'm sure he'll be disappointed, and I'm sure he is desperately searching for his A game again. But I do not think he is very far away from that at all. It's just those big shots in the crunch moments that have been letting him down this season. But losing in back-to-back finals against an in-form Mark Selby is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. And that does neatly lead us on to our champion. Now, I've already been singing Mark's praises in my review of the Champion of Champions, and I am back doing the very same thing here a few weeks later. Just like the Champion of Champions, Mark looked right at his very best last week. That confidence in his game is back, which is so good to see, because we know he's had a really rough time of things off the table recently. And go back about 18 months or so, and he was having thoughts of packing it in altogether. And now he's here, a 3-time UK champion now, which takes his tally of Triple Crown titles up to double digits. And apart from a little wobble in the evening session of the final, he was breezing through what was a very difficult route to the title. Li Paifan in the opening round could have been a banana skin, because we've all seen what Li has been doing over the past 12 months. He was then far too strong for Zhao Yulong, who not only beat O'Sullivan in the first round, but he's also had a pretty decent season so far too. He showcased all of his match play abilities to comfortably get past Barry Hawkins in the quarterfinals, and then put in a near faultless display to beat an in-form Shaun Murphy in the semi-finals too. And like I say, he was on course to win the final at a canter as well, until he started making some unforced errors, which was gifting Judd a route back into the final. Now, there was a moment of a little bit of controversy in that second session when Selby was leading 7-3, and he was given a free ball which would have offered him a clear run to the winning line in that frame. But Judd strongly disputed it, and it did kind of feel like Mark felt compelled to refuse the free ball, which he did. Then, of course, Judd went on to fluke the red, win the frame, and the final sort of began to turn around from that point onwards. Now look, I'm certainly not suggesting here that Judd was cheating or anything of the sort at all, but it did look like the ref had made the right call from my screen, and it would have been a little contentious if Judd had turned that final around and won it. But apart from those blemishes towards the end of the match, Mark was incredible. He really, really was. Every part of his game is in such good shape right now. To win the Champion of Champions and the UK title already represents an amazing season, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the season could get even better. He is now the first player to win multiple titles this season, and when we look at the Masters, and even more so the World Championship, he has the chance to make this season so much better. And to finish off the video, as is tradition, we also got the Masters draw during yesterday's final as well. From a fan of Neil Robertson's standpoint, the draw could have been nicer, but in actual fact, it's probably fans of O'Sullivan who are more concerned about that draw. Judd and Ding will also repeat their UK quarterfinal from this season as well, but I am getting ahead of myself. I will have my full preview of the Masters out at the start of the new year, but for now, there's a couple of tournaments left to play, but the focus really is all on Mark Selby, who after a few years in the wilderness is back. And the concern for the rest of the tour is he might not be done yet.